Okay, well, thank you for joining me again, Ashley. This is part two, I guess, of our conversation that we had last time. We began last time around regenerative agriculture, around decentralized communities, around your philosophy of doomer optimism, and all sorts of really cool topics that we covered in the last one. And for anybody who's watching this one, catch the first one first, maybe, so you'll have some context for what we're going to do right now. And so thanks again for joining me this morning. It's something like, what is it there? 11, 11, 11. 11,
Yep,
11. That's great. All right. And we're going to just, I asked my students to come up with some questions, and they came up with some really great questions. And for the sake of those who are watching, Ashley took a look at these before our conversation right now, and found them to be pretty interesting as well. So I don't have a particular order here, and we don't have all the time it would take, I think, to cover all of these questions, because there's some rich questions, and I'm sure some very rich answers. So we'll just get through as many as we can get through in the time that we have, and and we'll just let everybody else who had other questions, or people who have questions while they're watching this, let them be tantalized, and allow them to kind of pursue their own inquiries based on what you're saying in this conversation. So here we go. So I'm going to start with Lauren's question, and this is based on a article that you shared with us in Yes Magazine, that I shared with my students in Yes Magazine, about an initiative that's across the Great Plains of the U.S., across the Midwest, of farmers who are getting together and connecting around issues having to do with climate change and basically survival in the context of a changing world. They come from all different political persuasions, agricultural methodologies, all sorts of different angles and orientations, and they've found a shared interest, and that is survival. And so they've set their differences aside, or incorporated them into some rich kinds of debates that lead them to places that they want to go. And it's a really great model. So you shared that article with us, and so Lauren has a question about that. So Lauren's talking about these people sharing their ways of regenerative agriculture for their neighboring communities. She asked, do you think the students that you're educating in the Rizoma Field School will make a big enough impact in their own communities after coming home from studying abroad with you and learning new ways of life?
Yep. Okay. So yes, thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here again. The last conversation was so great and generative. So and these questions are so good. I'm happy to have this conversation. So yeah, the Practical Farmers of Iowa are a really cool model, because they're literally, many of them are farmers in agriculture. Many of them not your typical climate change concerned citizen. Typically, there are a lot of farmers, especially for commodity crops, are tend to be conservative, tend to be skeptical. However, they notice like changing climate patterns, and basically they're working together to do agriculture despite the challenges, and to do it in the best way possible, and forming these like broad coalitions for the practical goal of producing. I love this model because it's just in line with all of the research I've been doing on these different communities of people. They're basically communities of practice, people who work on activities together towards some sort of shared goal across diverse ideological the diverse ideological spectrum. And I think like it's just a completely underrated approach towards social change, is to think about just building something, having some sort of community around a shared goal, even if it's just you and one other neighbor working on some project together and it's a shared goal. So many people think social change comes via shared ideology. We have to share the same ideology. We need to be like-minded, and then we get together, and then we think of projects, I guess, that like match the ideology. And I'm arguing that the opposite is our likely path, because it is, sorry about the noise, it's super windy here. It is just, the ideological thing is really sort of tearing us apart, and really hard to, it's also hard to come up with practical ideas based on ideologies. If you think at all about like utopian ideals of, for example, there's been a conversation on Twitter recently about intentional communities. A lot of people are like, let's just build a town with our friends. Like, that's what we want to do. We don't want to be in the city anymore. Let's build a town. Yes, sounds great in theory. Who's going to manage the septic system? How does governance work? How does buying into the community or leaving the community work? Like, what's the legal framework? All of those things where you start with the utopian vision, and the utopian vision just sort of sounds like a potluck or something fun. But in reality, I think there's just a lot of practical considerations to work out. So in my opinion, it works better to work on something practical. In this case, it's agriculture in the face of climate change, but there's lots of different ways to do that. Separately, the field school, like, I'm just a drop in the bucket in terms of making actual social change from my school. It's just, I think we've had 5 cohorts of students, on like 12 students. So it's, it's a tiny amount of people. The larger goal I have is to use the school as a pilot or as a model for a type of education, which is experiential, which holds up people who have practical skills as teachers, which co-creates with them, and also forces students to learn through hands-on experiences and conversation in tandem. So for me, I think the model itself has really strong potential transformative power. A lot more people are interested in it. Now I've run enough cohorts that I feel like I know well what works and what doesn't work, and the most transformative aspects. Yes, I have heard from students that this trip, which is like, people who came to our school, they come in like 10-day trips. They're not long, like, even semester long immersive experiences. I have heard back from students who have come here saying like, wow, this totally changed like the trajectory of my life, because it changed, my frame of reference as to what is possible and what's worth pursuing. So for me, I think that comes through experiences, it comes through relationships, and it comes from being in the context of people who are succeeding with their projects. And so like the students who come to my field school, they work with small scale agroecology farmers, and it's not just the pulling weeds, and it's not just the conversation, it's not just the planting trees, it's not just the building a shed out of we build a shed out of mud and straw and pallets, wood pallets, shipping pallets. It's not just any one of those activities, it's the whole. It's being on the farm, it's seeing it all, how it works together. And I feel like that model, just being in a place with people who are succeeding, and have a strong approach that they're testing and succeeding at. Yeah, it's super transformative for people to just be there and experience that.
Yeah, I love that word transformative really jumps out at me there. So what I'm thinking about when I hear what you're saying is I'm thinking about this one thing that we, I guess, because of our social conditioning, and I mean ours as in, industrialized, disoriented, alienated society, we're kind of conditioned within those contexts to sort of feel again, lack of connection, but then this participation right there is kind of an answer anyway. And what you're saying is that as we participate in things that allow us to slow down, to reconnect, to kind of re-envision our place in the world, that then provides maybe some inspiration and maybe some perspectives that then perhaps prepare us for going back into the world in a way. I know that your community isn't so much, wouldn't be classed in the retreat center kind of model, but at the same time,
Right.
it is a kind of retreat for the people who are visiting for short periods.
Right.
And so they're giving them a chance to reconnect to natural world, to living things, to ways of life that are slower, that allow us to kind of feel that we have a place in the world, because we're coming from a world that constantly sends us a message that we don't belong, really. And so
Yeah.
I
also, I would just
please.
say, I would just add that it's like, I think a lot of the people who have, let's just say, a more balanced, healthy life, like many of my neighbors, it's very hard to make legible what's successful and not successful about that model. It's very hard to describe in words. It's also probably, if you were to ask many of them, they probably wouldn't have the words to even describe it. Like, it's the water, it's the air they breathe, it's the water they swim in. Like, it's just their whole context. And so for me, instead of making it legible in some way, like, oh, look at these people, they really know how to live, and here's what they're doing, and here's your plan of action to be exactly like them. Instead, it's just noticing. And I think back to some of my travels. I stayed with a family on a work exchange in Italy, and they had a patio outside covered with wisteria, this plant that has little purple flowers that hang down. And they just ate a long lunch every day outside under this patio. And it was, they wouldn't say like the key to a slow life is sitting outside at a patio under wisteria, but that one experience in the context of the whole life taught me something about what options are available for life.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's yep, exactly right. And right, it's not a curriculum that instills you with certain kinds of knowledge that you go back and then apply, but more of it's creating a new context in which you can re-envision yourself and your place in the world. And I think that's so important nowadays. So important nowadays. There's another piece, and I know if I'm not careful that I will be bringing my own questions into this and not sharing my students' questions. So I'm going to give into temptation here a little bit and say another thing that I heard in what you were sharing was there's also a recognition of the value that that those out there who have skills, who have life experience, that allows us to cultivate those different ways, those different approaches of living in the world. That they're out there, they're everywhere, they're all around us. But again, our social context, our socialization prevents us from seeing their value. So they end up getting marginalized in a way. And so part of what you're talking about is reacquainting those of us who are wanting to rediscover those ways of living, those philosophies, those methods, the tools, the techniques. Those of us who are interested in reacquainting ourselves with those are then kind of inspired to go find them. To find them in the living experience and the models, the examples of those who are out there all around us all the time anyway, but that have been kind of in a sense marginalized. So it seems like that would be another outcome for students coming down there, spending some time and just witnessing the value in folks who have these kinds of these traditional knowledge and all other kinds of knowledge. Does that seem like a good way of summarizing some of that?
Yeah, that sounds totally right. And I think that you really hit the nail on the head is people with practical initiatives, not just ideological or utopian or vision-based initiatives. So practical initiatives, I think, is really key. And I think, like, just back to the beginning of this question, the practical farmers of Iowa, in my opinion, are not being lifted up as like the people we need to be like learning from or studying with. They're like, oh yeah, look at these, weird farmers, or, they're doing some little initiative. And I think like if I'm to add anything to the world, it is a perspective that these people with practical knowledge who are doing things on the ground and making community and solving problems, despite all the challenges, they are like the heroes of our story. They are the ones to learn from, and you don't need to go to Uruguay to learn that. There are people everywhere if you change your lens as to who is worth learning from, and who is a teacher, and who is I think we have this attitude that experts are people who are highly educated and extremely decorated. And I feel really lucky because I've gone to fancy schools. I've got the highest degree there is, and I know like the limitations to experts. And that's really good because now I don't have to worship experts, the people who our society treats as experts. And I personally would like to sort of flip on its head who we think of as experts.
That is so important. And I feel like when I look at what's going on in the world today, I feel like we're on the cusp of, as societies, we're on the cusp of recognizing that. It's just like there's a trauma around that shift from from one place to another. And I think we're in that chaos right now. But I feel like that the seeds of a kind of rejuvenation are in that very perspective. I'm going to ask Nicole's question next, and I feel like the answer is already in what we've just been talking about, but I want to frame it differently so that maybe if there's other thoughts or you want to connect the dots yourself, you can do that. So Nicole asks, how did you pull through the doomer stage? Did it happen naturally over time, or was there a moment when you realized you had to shift your focus to a solution?
Okay, so yeah, this is very much tied up with my personal biography, and I think that there's probably no way that it can't. The answer to this question for people, I think almost always has to be tied up with their personal biography. But so basically growing up, I grew up in a working class household. Like, we didn't get the newspaper. I didn't know about current events. It was, our focus was sort of just hyper local family, community, school, this kind of thing. We didn't really, like other families, we didn't really go to the library very often. So we were kind of, I wasn't that aware of things going on out in the world, which in some, you can make a case that that's good or bad, whatever. But by the time I got to college, I had this sense like there's a lot I need to know about and want to know more about. And so then I, just went through this rapid transformation in college. I got a full academic scholarship to school, which made me able to be able to go to a pretty good college, and then basically had to like get up to speed on everything that's going on in the world, which was horrible. What I found out was horrible. I mean, it was so shocking, especially coming from my childhood, where it was, I mean, it was almost an apolitical upbringing. And then, just sort of shocked by it all, I took this class in college called Is Development Sustainable? Just asking the question, like, is development at all something that is sustainable? And this is 2006, studied abroad in Rome. So I got a sense of like the ancient cultures and the collapse of that ancient Rome, and then, but also, different ways of life in Italy. And there are other things out there, this kind of thing. Then I went on like a whole long exploratory phase in my 20s, which involved a lot of travel. So I basically, I didn't have any like funding or anything like that. I saved money from babysitting families, and living very cheaply, never going to the movies, never going out to eat, eating as cheaply as I could to save money, and then go on these long overland trips. And I went, to something like 35 countries, and I did different work exchanges and worked on farms. And And basically, I just lived with this open question, like, what else is there? What solutions are there? The problem seems so big and overwhelming. Like, what, how are other people in the world dealing with this? What other ways of living are there, et cetera, et cetera. And then I went back to the US and just back into the thick of it. Like, wow, it's so, there's the trajectory, the writing is just on the wall. I'm studying sociology and learning what sociologists have to think about, the trajectory of the US, and it's not good. It's extremely scary. And then the people who actually study it tell, I read about, the different seeds being planted in these different, in medicine and education, that are just blossoming into horrible outcomes, these assumptions that get planted, and then, oh my gosh, the outcomes of this are so bad. What are we going to do? And I think there was a point, I know there was a point basically before moving to Uruguay where I just thought, like, okay, I need to try out something else. Like the trajectory, if I were to stay in the US, and there's another question about this, maybe we can get into more depth, but if I were to stay in the US, like, I just cannot abide this trajectory. I just cannot swim against the current my whole life. I'm too sensitive of a person. I cannot, like, just spend my whole life fighting with people and telling them, like, screaming like this is super scary, or bad or whatever. A lot of people, sort of go with the flow attitude and just don't, aren't critical about it. They don't have my whole set of experiences, etc. And there was in my neighborhood, I'm from the south side of Chicago, there was a shooting of an altercation and a shooting from an off-duty police officer to, a guy passing through. It wasn't really clear exactly how it played out. And it seemed like both parties were too aggressive and probably both at fault, but it's just like this causes uproar in my community. Like, the person passing through was, of course, at fault because it's a community high in police officers. And I just felt like, oh my gosh, it was like the peak of my doomerism. It's just, this is not a sustainable society. This isn't a sustainable way to relate to one another. We just can't do this. And I think I was writing about this the other day on Twitter. I almost feel like adherence to the modern trajectory and resultant doomerism is almost like an addiction. It's like, you're kind of stuck in it and you tell yourself, that there's no way out, and that there's no other options, and that it's the only way you can cope is to go along with it. And depression and anxiety too, it's just this cycle where you're stuck inside and you can't really see another option until you do. And that's the miracle part. Is I don't know the answer to that question, because everybody has a different answer, whether they're an alcoholic or they've handled their own depression or whatever, where they just have a moment like, I just can't do this anymore. I can't live life in this state of mind. And then you just take a bet on something else, you make a change. And for us, it was getting on a plane with two little kids to Uruguay. We already had bought land, so we had the seed planted to try something different. And yeah, the answer to the fundamental answer to the question, I don't know if anyone in the whole world could ever articulate the actual mechanism where you hit rock bottom or you think, I can't do this anymore, and you make a change. But yeah, it's to me very similar to those kinds of trajectories.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it seems like there's this two things going on at the same time. There's the recognition, the sort of consciousness raising that happened for you when you were looking at what's going on in the world, and then seeing it on your doorstep, essentially, and getting, excuse me, getting, really horrified and terrified at the prospect of where things are heading. So there's that piece. And then there's the other piece where you had an opportunity to kind of explore the world, which awakened you to the possibility for other ways of life. And so those two, like you say, you can't really tell where they intersect, or where where a particular intersection of them causes, a change, but there they are. They're running parallel, and then they're intersecting at different places, and that's where you're sort of coming out of the valley of darkness, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I think the key is, at least for my theory of social change too, is the key for me is to expose people to the alternatives that exist, so that if they do get to a point where they're like, I cannot do this anymore, they can think to, this experience or this thing that they read or this person that they heard speak about their experience and their lifestyle. And then it sparks something. I'm going to go explore that. I know that there are other options out there. And I think for a lot of people, the inability to move beyond doomerism is a lack of solutions that feel salient to them, and so for me, the whole project of Doomer Optimism is not me saying, here's the solution. It's instead me saying, there are dozens of solutions. All these people are working on them. Rarely is anyone paying attention to these people. So I'm just trying to lift them up and say, you're not alone. The doomerism, it's real, but there are ways out of it. And here, pick your joy, not pick your poison, pick your joy.
Oh, I love that. That's really great. Grace, we have two Graces in the class, so this is one of the Graces. Had a question that I think is really pertinent here, because in the face of this kind of recognition that people are having that things are getting really dire in different ways, socially, environmentally, and so forth. There's this sense among some that they should just not contribute to the next generation, that the next generation will be suffering from all of this, that there's no point in having children in a world that's changing so drastically in the wrong direction, et cetera. And so there's, I don't know if you call it a movement, but there's a lot of people out there who are making this choice. So Grace's question is, how do you reconcile raising children as someone who has special insights into societal collapse?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about this a ton recently, and we're actually recording a whole session on Doomer Optimism in 3 days on parenting in this world. And so I'm curious to hear other people's perspectives on this too, because it's something I've thought about with regard to my own life, but I haven't heard the whole gamut of different approaches from different people, where I could as a sociologist, I gather up people's perspectives and then synthesize them. In my opinion, for me, having children is it's alongside this general philosophical perspective toward choosing life, fundamentally, philosophically choosing life, choosing something to care about, choosing something to take care of, choosing something to want to make the world better for. And I think there is, I don't want to get too judgmental or to pathologize too many people or paint with broad brushstrokes, but there is something I've said is a pathological perspective, where if you're too embedded in the doomerism for too long, and you're just, your daily life is thinking about and fixating on all the problems of the world, it leads to a sort of perverse perspective toward parenting and toward life and continuing to live. So it's along the same lines as a lot of environmental solutions that talk about the ways in which you should castigate yourself and hold back from enjoying life to save the planet, this kind of thing. And in my opinion, there are ways to enjoy life more living sustainably. I mean, we have very little electricity use. Learning how to keep chickens and have a garden and plant fruit trees, this is a beautiful life. This is something better than not eating meat or not flying or not driving in your car. It's all this like attitude of not, as opposed to an attitude of, okay, well, what is a positive and joyful replacement of the not? You know, what should we move toward? And I think there's just this tension between, you know, I guess, I think just like a destruction versus creation attitude. It's like, I want to destroy the industrial, techno, you know, capitalist world. Okay, yes, you know, but all your focus, if all your focus is on destruction, it's very hard to get out of doomerism and to think and move toward creation. And I think parenting is like, it's all wrapped up in that, because it's to me like just the joy and the miracle of making new life, and to move towards something beautiful and joyful for them, parenting them and thinking about the next generation, and then thinking about building beautiful intergenerational familial ties that are healthy, that are a good model for the future. I think all of those things are tied up in it. And at least for me, yeah, it's tied up in the doomer versus optimism whole philosophy. You know, it's really, you know, I just want to explicitly say, if we actually said, Patrick and I, when we came to Uruguay in 2012, we said, like, we're not going to have any kids until we have a plan as to where we're going to raise them. And we literally bought land on that trip and then got pregnant with my first soon after returning home from that trip. So it was like, all right, we got a plan. We know where we're going to go with her. And for me, like, that was a very intentional thing. And so, yeah, I think it sort of also catapulted me and us into, like, you know, having a good solid place for her to grow up, where it's, you know, it's going to be a nice childhood for my kids.
I feel like we could, and you are actually, I feel like we could dedicate an entire full-length conversation to this topic. I mean, this is tip of the iceberg type stuff, and it's so important. I mean, so much comes to mind in hearing what you're saying about it. For example, you know, some of the world's great religions, for example, focus on the kind of, well, to use a Taoist term, the yin yang of creation and destruction, right? The two are interwoven, inextricably interwoven with each other. And so, you know, in so many world religions, there's this recognition of that. And so if you're kind of getting sucked into the vortex of destruction, and this is kind of one other way to say what you already articulately said, you kind of forget that again, inextricably woven into it is creation. And so there's a journey there to be had. And then I feel like this is where the subject of hope comes up again. All the different definitions of hope that are out there that we're playing with now as individuals and groups. What value is there in hope? And with one definition, it seems like it's not useful. You know, the definition that somebody, some brilliant billionaire or some technology or some external divine intervention or whatever is going to come along and save us, so we don't really have to do anything. We just sort of be hopeful. That seems like an approach that doesn't have much merit anymore in this world. Whereas this hope that comes from agency, from the sense that you, with the help of others, can create something new, that this is where you kind of move into the creation side of that yin yang. Arising from that is a different kind of hope, and one that allows us to envision a future for another generation. That allows us to envision making change happen that actually takes hold and is full of the vibrancy of new life. I would definitely agree. And the only other thing I would add is that the agency part is so central for me, because I think there is something almost like the yin yang of
creation and destruction. There's also, I think, maps onto this in a loose fashion is consumption versus production. That we often think of ourselves as like passive consumers, and our only agency is in what we consume and how we choose to consume, and the ways in which we signal our consumption. And I think moving toward the act of production, whether it's, and this sounds silly to say raising children, but it's an act of creation. Being involved in the act of creation, creating something, creating a life for them, even creating a household culture, creating a way in which they relate to the world and teaching them. And then, in other ways, moving toward the act of production. I think there's just so much, not just joy in it, but strength. And then that strength then also reinforces the challenges you're faced by the doom. So it's just this, sort of virtuous cycle once you step into it. And I think a lot of people don't realize that they either think, that's not something I could do, or they don't feel powerful enough, or capable enough. But a lot of this stuff is, it's a learn on the job type thing. What parenting is a learn on the job type thing. You start doing it, and then you react, and then you learn and you improve. And it's this iterative experimentation of production. I think that's super central.
Yeah, and there's so many different forms that creation can take, at the personal level and at the family level and at the community level. It does seem like an abundance of opportunities that are obscured by the assumptions of everything being destroyed and nothing coming from it. I mean, in physics, we know about the Big Bang theory. There was something from nothing there too. So it seems like you're right. It does seem like there needs to be effort actually put into embracing both sides, and understanding how they're integrated. So, not to get all philosophical and everything, because we are talking about practical, living in a way with real implications for our quality of life. But in that is also a change in perspective that seems to emerge kind of organically from it, really. I just wanted to plug really quickly your podcast. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that, because I'll put in the description below this video, I'll put in a link to the podcast, but maybe you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's just, basically doomer optimism was just a funny phrase I used in jest on Twitter, because talking with so many people who are just wrestling with these same concepts, I just said, oh yeah, we're the doomer optimists. And then it stuck, which is so funny. And also so perfect, because like I hate the idea of being some sort of guru. I love the idea of being some sort of party planner. So basically I've been just noticing other people who are doing similar things, and then interacting with them, and then lifting them up. And then we have conversations back and forth on Twitter, but then the podcast is basically grown out of those conversations, where we have longer form conversations, and we're just sort of talking with the gamut of perspectives. We're talking to people who are, super into prepping and Second Amendment rights and protection and all of this stuff. We're talking to people who are building technological solutions to measure soil carbon and soil health and ecological health. So like that's way out of my wheelhouse, but let's talk about it. I had a conversation with a couple of guys who are building in village scale in industrial models, meaning like being able to do small, tiny scale industry to produce for a village scale type stuff. And the thing that they're starting with was a distillery. So that's cool. So they're like, giving people plans to make their own distillery in their town, and this is what they're experimenting with, to people who are just doing homesteading and trying to live off the land more with their family, people who are who talk a lot about disaster preparedness and how to get involved in community, all this kind of stuff. So basically, we're just having longer form conversations with people, doing practical stuff on the ground.
That's fantastic. Yeah, more. We need more and more of that. And again, obviously, it brings in people with different perspectives, some of which we might agree with or not agree with, and just trying to learn from each other. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, I also would just say, like, I honestly feel like we're in this world where there are increasingly gurus and cults, and I want to be like explicitly anti-guru and anti-cult by making people who are not in a groupthink situation interact. And I almost feel like the skill of interacting is increasingly being lost, and it's essential to interact with people who have diverse experiences and viewpoints, but I also think it strengthens each of our individual ideas by having to talk across differences. And I think in general we have these silos with groupthink where the thinking kind of goes off the rails because they're not like interacting with anyone outside of their group. So part of the thing is to make people, just yesterday I'm having the people involved in Do More Optimism write mini manifestos with their perspective. And some people told me, yeah, I'll write it, and they haven't yet written it, but they want to tell me what they're gonna write. So they write a little teaser, one line. And one man's teaser is named Tucker Max. He wrote, basically about you have to be able to defend yourself. And then another person said, well, you can defend yourself all you want, but you have to have community, and you have to find people who find a way to get everybody involved so you don't have to defend yourself. And then this kind of back and forth, I think it strengthens all of our perspectives.
That's wonderful. I mean, we both are products of the higher education, the world of higher education, and we both have a critique of it, I think, and that that's a conversation, another one that could last an hour easily. That said, it expanded your world when you were in college, and the same thing happened for me in all kinds of ways. And speaking, just I guess plugging my own field, anthropology, this is something that I feel like, I mean, there are perspectives and there are methods for engaging in exploring differences and finding, and learning from that, those kinds of conversations where we challenge our own worldviews. I feel like that, as you kind of pointed out, that isn't something that's not the direction as societies that we're moving in. It's instead kind of contracting into our own bubbles and worldviews to protect ourselves, and sort of an act of self-preservation. And we need more of this space that we create, which is what I'm kind of feeling like is happening in your podcast and in other places. I try to do this in my teaching, to try to create this space for those kinds of ways of engaging. And what comes from that is a sense of, oh, I see now. Now my point of view is enriched by opposite perspectives, or by angles of or by orientations that I hadn't considered before. I just feel like, wow, we all need to be out there doing what we can do in our own ways to create those kinds of spaces. So I'm excited that you're doing that with the podcast. We have only a few minutes left. So my question to myself is, which one of these remaining questions am I going to ask? I don't know if there's one that jumped out at you that you wanted to answer, or I can kind of pick one myself.
You know what? The one about cities. There's a couple where people asked about cities. Caden asked, do you believe it would be possible for majorly developed areas, such as large metropolitan cities, to switch to more self-sufficient framework? Even Olivia asked a little bit about regenerative agriculture. Do you think, the US in particular has the ability to make social and cultural changes necessary to do something about it?
Right, and then Flora Marie also had this question about how does it get applied towards, this ideas of regenerative agriculture and so forth, applied towards larger population centers. So it does seem like there's a theme there that maybe you'd like to address. So I think basically
And actually, Grace P asked something similar to how do people, why do people make the switch to regenerative agriculture? What is the adjustment? That something we haven't touched on, that's pretty central to my own perspective is I tend to take this historical materialist point of view, which is more or less like, I think that the material world that we live in has impacts on how history and culture play out. Not that that they don't inform each other, but I tend to try to think in historical epics and try to understand like what is the underlying material conditions that cause this. And in the case of basically post-industrial revolution, starting in, let's just say, the 1700s in England, I personally think the importance of the role of fossil fuels is central to how it played out. It's just this insanely abundant source of energy that we learned how to harvest as humans. And then it just impacted everything about how we live everywhere in the world. And so there is an author, his name's Chris Smage. He's on the Doomer Optimist train. He's been on our podcast and good friend to our group. He wrote a book called A Small Farm Future, and he basically makes the argument that the oil, from the perspective of people watching, oil production and consumption goes up, and then there's a point at which it peaks because it's a finite resource, and then it sort of goes down. A lot of people think that as fossil fuel production goes down, we'll be able to just transition to some sort of alternative energy future. I've seen lots of skeptical arguments against that I'm pretty convinced by, that there's just the abundance and the portability of liquid fossil fuels. Now I'm getting a little wonky. It just makes the whole system run in a certain way that can't be easily transferred over to things like wind and solar. So it's going to be a major transformation either way, and probably lower energy either way, lower total energy consumption. So Chris argues that basically pre-1700s, the majority of the population, over 50%, and in some cases like 90-something%, were involved in some kind of small scale production of food or things, whether it's, there's this word I learned the other day that there's, I don't remember the word, but there in England, there's a culture of people who work in forests, making things out of wood, like little bowls and little baskets and little spoons and this kind of thing. There's a word for that. There's like this whole culture of small scale production that's pretty much the majority of human history. People are involved in some kind of small scale production, and usually on a land base that they're close to, where they're involved in managing the land base in perpetuity. They're involved in and connected to what happens to the land base as they use the resources. They see it with their own eyes. And then that causes a certain kind of culture of taking care of it in a certain way. And I would just argue that I think a lot of people in the modern era think like, we just need to teach people about regenerative agriculture principles and get the message out, and that's going to make the change. And I personally sort of think people are already and will increasingly reach crisis points where industrial agriculture will not work. For example, the price of fertilizer is going up. Fertilizer is primarily made out of fossil fuels. And so the price is going up. It's exploding. It's over the past couple months. Industrial agriculture is extremely reliant on this fertilizer being cheap and abundant. The whole system doesn't work if it doesn't have the fertilizer. So what's going to happen is that people will be forced to reckon with industrial agricultural producers will be forced to reckon with that, the cost going up, and have to shift their methods in one way or another. And what better fertilizer is there than manure? So then they get their animals on and they start rotating them, and then that builds the soil, and they'll learn from other people doing it. And my whole project is to try to get more people doing it sooner, so that when there's challenges, we can just slide right in and say, hey, look, I've worked out this system of regenerative agriculture, come to my farm, I'll show you how it works. And the transition is smoother and less painful for people, the transition will be painful either way, and there's like pretty much nothing to be done about that. On the topic of cities, Chris Smage argues that there's just going to be a lot more people who are going to end up moving into rural areas. Rural areas are extremely depopulated. I mean, even in like the last half century, and that's just not historically how people live. They usually don't live in giant megacities with, you know, imported resources. That takes a whole lot of energy to do. So probably a lot more people in rural areas or small towns on a land base. But then Chris Smage in his book, Small Farm Future, is also talking about these like historical systems in cities where even like little parks that have little orchards, and the orchard, the trees in the orchard are trained to grow in such a way that they go sort of like flat along walls, and maximizing the use of space in cities and this kind of thing. So I think it's just all of the above, the transition, but it's important to me, or at least it's helpful to me, to think in this historical materialist way, to think like, you know, what have we done for most of human history? How is this an anomaly? Where we live, what we live in and how we live is such an anomaly. It's a result of like super cheap and super abundant energy. And what will that mean for the future? And in my opinion, I think, you know, there's also a lot of hope in repopulating rural communities and in reviving small town life. You know, I think there's just there's a lot of creativity that can come from that, where it's a mix of the past and the present and the future, where, you know, we could have a cosmopolitan small town life. You know, now we could have young people populating a small town and having families and working together in a community garden, having a community pool, and, you know, this kind of walkable cities and this kind of thing. So anyways, that's my perspective towards that question.
I love it. Yeah, that's a great way to cap off our conversation too, I think, because it kind of brings us full circle to the very point you were making in the very beginning of our discussion, and that is when you are exposed to a different pace of life, to the you know, fruits of different kinds of labor, to the knowledge and, you know, wisdom that comes from the people who have that kind of life experience. Out of that comes a new vision for what it is to be human and human life in general, in community, in the context of the natural world. And perhaps that vision has always been there. It's just been obscured by this, as you call it, this anomaly that's happened over the last 200 plus years. And so that's what we're kind of left with, is this sense of hope that arises from the fact that what the work that we need to do, in addition to rediscovering these ways of life that bring people together rather than divide them, what the work we have to do is that re-envisioning work. When we expose ourselves to these different and more rooted, no pun intended, ways of life, we end up with a different idea for how we fit into the world and how we can fit into other people's lives as well, and make a different future. So that's a super positive, optimistic perspective, but that arises from that journey through the doomerism part of it. You know, to go through that journey again, to bring back to that biblical reference of the valley of darkness. It's a journey through that to the other side. It isn't like just staying in that valley and hunkering down, but rather moving through it. And then in that journey, you're meeting other people who are also making that trek. So this is wonderful. Just so much room for more thought and more discussion and all that kind of stuff. But this is a start. So thank you so much, Ashley. It's been brilliant. You know, that the feeling I had from our first conversation was super inspired, and now I feel that way again. So that's how I like to have conversations. So I want to thank you for that as well, and I hope others feel the same way.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and I wish you the best in everything you're doing, and I hope we can stay in touch, and can't wait to follow what you're doing next.
All right, sounds good. Thanks for having me. Have a
All
great
right,
one.
absolutely. You too, Ashley. Take care.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye.